Before we anti-affirm resolve, the United States federal government should impose price controls on the pharmaceutical industry. Our sole contention is correcting the market. There's a crisis in the United States revolving around the affordability of pharmaceutical drugs. Henry Waxman of the Commonwealth Fund reports in 2017, drug prices have increased 10% annually, exceeding inflation. Court of Market Watch corroborates in 2017, finding the price of most common medications have increased by 85%. Dana Sarnak of Johns Hopkins University further explains that compared to other high-income developing countries, U.S. prices are 117% higher and health outcomes are significantly worse. Pharmaceutical companies are at fault. Fox of the Harvard Business Review in 2017 reports drug companies utilize a number of tactics to thwart competition, including bribing generic companies to keep cheap alternatives off the market, filing citizen petitions to delay generics from being federally approved, and restricting small business access to drug samples for testing. Big Pharma has consolidated the market with monopoly-esque tactics, preventing affordable options from entering the market. Even generic drugs, supposedly more affordable, are driven off the market by Big Pharma. Large branded companies spike their prices right before generic entry to ensure high price points for both drugs. Dave of International Medicine quantifies in 2017 an average price increase of 30% increases generic drug prices by 60% as well. Thus, Dean Baker of New York Times concludes in 2016, prices are hundreds of times the normal free market price. When the market fails, the government steps in to put it back on track. Price controls reverse this in two ways. First, directly setting the price. Price controls means that firms aren't allowed to set prices above a certain level, leading to lower prices for consumers. No matter how much the industry is consolidated or exploits the market, the end result must be lower prices. This has empirically happened in similar countries that impose price controls. Marzak of the Croatian Medical Journal in 2002 reports, all EU countries imposed price ceilings and saw a reduction of prices by 25%. In the bigger market of the United States, a cost of the Cochrane Library quantifies in 2014, price controls in the US will reduce costs by 39% in just 1 year. Second is stopping consolidation. Source Public Citizen magazine reports in 2016, over the past few years have seen the consolidation of the pharmaceutical industry as larger companies captured 64% of the global market, up from 28% in 2007. Companies consolidate to hike up prices. Gagnon of Globalization Health Journal in 2017 reports that several companies dominate non-competitive markets by cornering niche markets through killer acquisitions so they can substantially increase prices. Price controls reverses this, since they remove the reason that companies monopolize in the first place. If they cannot increase prices, they have no incentive to acquire. But additionally, it makes it inefficient to have a monopoly in the first place, since they can no longer offset the high development costs with having high prices. Sued of the Rand Corporation in 2008 explains direct price controls will reduce Big Pharma revenues by 16%. For these two reasons, Brecky of the Journal of Public Economic quantifies in 2010, under a price control system, large monopolies see a 15% reduction in brand name market share and drop in average drug prices by 30%. Correcting the market has two impacts. First, in the United States, Waxman explains that 1/3 of Americans go without taking their prescription because of high costs. Fortunately, Levy of the Hebrew University Business School quantifies in 2014, setting prices 20% lower, increasing the number of patients using drugs by 23%. This is critical. Benjamin of Public Health quantifies in 2012, approximately 125,000 deaths per year in the United States are due to non-adherence to prescriptions. Second is in the rest of the world. Stanley of The Guardian explains that Big Pharma requires that domestic governments across the world transfer all intellectual property rights to the United States, meaning they can only buy from us. This extends the U.S. monopoly globally and prevents other countries from developing generics, which is why 1.4 billion people cannot afford the patented drugs needed to save their lives, and 75% of all global HIV patients cannot access cures because they only have patented options in their area. Because medicine should give people their life instead of a receipt, we affirm.
Can we see the Marzak evidence?
Yeah.
Can I see the card that says that price controls decrease the cost of drugs by 34%?
Yep.
Yeah.
39%. That is Marzak.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
So just mark that.
That's Marzak's 25.
Thanks, Albie. It's 20 seconds.
Is anybody not ready? Okay.
We negate and contention one is lobbying. Big Pharma is ready to fight against regulations aimed at decreasing the price of drugs. Dr. Robert Peer in 2018 contextualized that Big Pharma is dumping money into Congress aimed at thwarting serious efforts to decrease the price of prescriptions. This gives Big Pharma control over Congress in two ways. First, lobbying. The CRE in 2017 explained that currently there are 153 unique organizations lobbying in Congress on behalf of drug pricing, a number that has more than quadrupled since 2013. Dr. Peer further that in 2017 alone, drug makers spent $171 million lobbying in Congress, deploying 882 lobbyists to fight against decreased prices. Second, campaign financing. Dr. Peer finds that Big Pharma has made a contribution totaling $31 million toward the campaigns of congressmen. This problem exists within both parties, as the CPR in 2018 explains that 97% of senators and 93% of representatives have received campaign donations from Big Pharma. This huge amount of control of Congress is why Dr. Peer concludes that Big Pharma has been able to beat back the proposed payment decrease it received from Medicare and Medicaid, and why over half of all major decisions in this administration has favored the pharmaceutical industry. The impact of sidestepping legislation. Pharma's influence on Congress ensures that new legislation will never meaningfully affect big companies but can destroy competition in the market. Theodore Morgan in 2017 explains that manufacturers can earn high profits by lobbying for regulation that hurt competitors while developing methods to sidestep current legislation, concluding that this incentivizes firms to relocate regulatory niches where they're safe from competition. Contention 2 is monopolies. The United States competitive and free market props up small firms, enabling them to thrive. This is especially true in the pharmaceutical industry, with Karen Kerrigan in 2018 quantifying that 57% of pharmaceutical companies are small businesses. Small firms also represent the future of the industry, with the Milken Institute in 2016 predicting that small business will represent 70% of the industry's future clinical pipeline. Unfortunately, Scott Shane in 2018 explained that government regulations such as price controls disproportionately harm small businesses in three ways. First is cost. Shane furthers that regulatory compliance places a disproportionate burden on small business because it's easier for large companies to spread out the fixed costs of adhering to legislation over more revenue. Second, skepticism. Morton and Baller in 2017 explained that high prices are uniquely important for small firms who derive their entire profit margins off one or two drugs. Indeed, Shane continues that increased regulation creates uncertainty across small firms, which blocks them from increasing investment, hiring new workers, or buying capital equipment. Third, investment. Investopedia in 2018 contends that regulation favors pharma companies large enough to have reliable sources of income. Unfortunately, Cliff in 2018 forwards that lowering drug profits would make pharma less desirable for investors who might see more profits in other industries not regulated by price controls. This will hurt small business, with Grabowski in 2017 reporting that decreasing returns particularly affects young startups that require investment in particularly uncertain early-stage R&D. Overall, the Milken Institute in 2016 indicates that private investment flows freely and investors will not hesitate to jump ship and find more profitable enterprises. Investors are already skeptical due to high-risk nature of R&D investment, and price controls tipped it over the edge. For all these reasons, Ben Guidance in 2015 of the American Action Forum confirms that every 10% increase in regulatory cost decreases the number of small businesses within an industry by 6%. With Emma Dean in 2018 finding that after price controls were implemented in India, the market share of small firms decreased by 15%. The impact is decreased quality medicine. Small firms account for most of the innovation within pharma. Lawrence Norton in 2011 explains that big firms can make large revenues off slowly improving multiple products, but small firms don't have the volume necessary to employ this strategy, which is why he concludes that small businesses have to focus on product innovation to make profits. Gellinger in 2018 empirically confirms this by finding that 62% of all new medicine approved by the FDA came from startups. This decrease in small business is why Lanchow in 2005 indicates that any price controls lowers the probability of high-quality drugs being launched by 33%. Lichtenberg in 2003 terminalizes this, reporting that the average new drug saves 18,800 life years each year. The impact extends beyond the United States because Linda Gerges in 2016 explains that startups are leading the push to bring innovative medicine to the developing world at affordable prices, which is why John Wu in 2017 empirically confirms that pharmaceutical innovation has been responsible for a 73% increase in life expectancy across the developing world, thus negate.
I see two pieces of evidence. 57% are small businesses, 70% future industry pipeline. Sure. 52%.
What was the other one?
70% of future industry pipeline. You guys good?
Yes, sir.
about your first contention. Let's say that the legislation is Advil costs $5 now. Give me a loophole.
All right, sure. So for example, Advil would say, okay, so for example, you could implement a loophole that says that when you import drugs, they're exempt from price controls. What Advil could do is they could load their Advil onto a truck, move it outside of the United States, move it back in, at which point it would count as an imported drug and they just sell it at the same
Is there a
price.
bill that says this?
Yeah, i.e., when we tried to impose when we tried to impose price controls on lumber in the 70s, what happened was the lumber companies would simply transport their lumber outside the United States, at which point it would count as imported
Is Advil
lumber.
lumber?
What?
Is Advil lumber?
You still have to move the Advil. So like you can still put the Advil on a truck, move it outside the U.S.
I
and
would
move it back
say
in.
the legislation is pretty straightforward. It's going to say pharma companies can't charge this much more. You can't
Yeah,
really make a loophole.
You can assume
But
that.
even if your argument is true, that's like really abusive. It means that none of the pros advocacy has any ground. So I would say you either say it's abusive or you just say like you drop this contention.
I say it's correct, which is our argument is ultimately that the most probable implementation of the affirmative ends up being rife with loopholes
That's
that
fine.
ultimately make the legislation.
I think you can add a question. Sure.
Okay. What's the internal link to this IP argument?
Oh, intellectual property?
Yeah.
We say monopolies in the U.S. buy up intellectual property from other countries, which means other countries can only buy the patented drugs from the U.S., which, because the prices are so high, 1.4 billion people in the developing world cannot afford their drugs. Can I ask you a question?
One follow-up, because I'm still a little confused.
Of course.
Okay, so how do you solve all monopolies?
The monopolies are based in the U.S. You break them down in the U.S. affects the developing world IPs. Can I ask you a question?
One more step further, like I'm still a little bit confused exactly how price controls directly impact all
Yeah,
monopolies.
so it's like the same word for like buying mergers and acquisitions, right? You have to
Sure.
buy up patents from other countries as well. If you don't have as much money, logically makes sense you can't buy up those patents.
Okay,
Let me ask you a question. All right. On your second contention, you talk about monopolies. You cite the Guinness evidence that says a 10% increase in regulatory costs puts 6% of small businesses out of business.
Yeah, sure.
Is that about the pharmaceutical industry?
It's in the comments of small business, which
Okay, so
small
it's not.
sectors of the
Okay.
pharmaceutical industry
Isaac,
have.
the simple answer is it's not about the pharmaceutical industry. What does the Guinness evidence assume?
Are you trying to tell me?
Yeah. So it
Lay it on.
assumes that there's not a monopoly in the market, which also makes sense, right? If there's a free market, regulation probably hurts small businesses.
I disagree
But
that
if there's a
it doesn't
monopoly,
assume that.
the small business has no edge, and you have to
Sure.
break down the monopoly
There's
first.
a relative monopoly in just about every industry. In the case of big pharma, that would mean that this analysis still works both ways. Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Okay, so your evidence indicates that drug prices are increasing by 27% every year. Is that correct?
We read 10% at the top.
Okay,
But like, if you give us 27, that's good.
okay, and nah, okay. So then you say, it's gonna be good.
We're gonna take that starting now.
Okay, oh, wait, how much time do you use?
We have a minute 8 left. Okay. Is everyone ready? All right. First off, we're already ahead in this debate on probability. Their arguments are very speculative. The fact that somehow lobbying is going to poke all of these loopholes into it and all small businesses are going to go belly up is very improbable. Whereas the moment you vote for Andrew and I, you directly reduce prices, you directly save consumers, that's 100% probable. Well, let's get into their contentions. Their first argument talks about lobbying, but there's so many issues with this. First of all, the moment you affirm, you fiat that the policy is passed immediately. There isn't time for all this lobbying to go underway. There isn't time for loopholes to develop. Secondly, the example that they give is we're going to drive drive a truck out into Canada and import it back in. That's still not a loophole. In the United States, they can only charge at a certain cost. There isn't a loophole when you're directly setting the price in the first place. That's why price controls are direct in the resolution. But thirdly, given the current climate of how price controls are being implemented, there's no probability that's going to be implemented through Congress. Back in August, President Trump has been passing executive orders to limit the pharmaceutical industry by limiting things like the gag rule. Trump isn't going to be lobbied by the pharmaceutical companies. We can still pass it through the executive branch. But fourthly and finally, even if you think that lobbying is incredibly bad, we're the only team that has a risk of stopping lobbying in the future, because if you limit their capacity with these sue evidence, we reduce their revenue by 20%, then they no longer have the capacity to lobby bills in the first place in Congress, which means we're the only risk of stopping them from poking loopholes in every single piece of pharmaceutical legislation to come in the future. So we also outweigh on the time frame of the argument as well. But more specifically, they're just using this to bolster their argument on small businesses, because they're going to be saying small businesses are disproportionately hurt with their second intention. But there are a couple of uniqueness issues right off the bat. Their evidence that talks about how new drugs are only being produced by small companies is because the industry is so efficient, we're only letting people with 50 or fewer employees producing it in the first place. Light of Stanford explains in 2014 that 90% of all new drugs that are coming out of the industry are clinically insignificant Me Too drugs that are essentially just changing Advil to ibuprofen and not benefiting people in the developing world per their impact says. This is a reason to turn the argument in our favor, because in a world of price controls, the only drugs that have any profit margin for small businesses and big pharmaceutical companies to invest in are the ones that cure things like cancer, cure diseases like Alzheimer, and have clinical significance in the first place. But secondly, if there's a monopoly in the industry, small businesses are not being helped. That's why we read you the source tester evidence in our second link that says 64% of the market is controlled by one company. Small businesses do not have a competitive edge right now. They're being price gouged by the larger industries, which stops them from starting up in the first place, because no one's going to invest in a market that has a monopoly in it in the first place. Which is why all of their evidence, the GITIS analysis and the Dean analysis, are all about general small businesses that aren't specific to the pharmaceutical industry whatsoever. Of course, if there's a free market, regulatory costs would probably hurt them, but because there's a monopoly, we're the only one with the risk of helping small businesses in the future. Let's go on to their specific arguments in their specific links. They say that regulatory burdens are going to disproportionately hurt small businesses, but that's not true either. Small businesses can produce things at a lower price point in a local area, so if anything, price controls stop price gouging by leveling the playing field for small businesses to compete with big pharmaceutical companies as well. Secondly and thirdly, they both of their warrants about skepticism and investment are all based on the same assumption that an investor or a small business isn't going to start up in the first place. But there are a couple of problems with this. The first one comes from the Brookings Institute, who explains in 2018 that 2% of all investment in the sector comes from venture capitalists in the first place, so it's a very small scope of the argument here. But again, on top of that, Zealand of the INC explains that venture capitalist investment is extremely bad for small businesses because they're reliant on a short-term make back my money ideology, which is why a lot of these small businesses that start up are destined to fail in the future, because they're just prioritizing short-term gains over long-term success in the first place. But on top of all of this, their link is that costs are going to go down, but in a world of price controls, that can be subsidized by the public sector. The Los Angeles Times explains that 73% of all of the new clinically significant drugs have come from the National Institute of Health in the public sector. Engelberg of Healthcare Magazines explains why this is a reason to vote against them, because when you implement price controls and you don't have to spend as much on things like Medicare and Medicaid, you can divert $80 billion in government funding to new innovation grants in the future, which is why our money towards innovation is a lot better than theirs.
It's 27 to use.
We have a minute 25.
It's going to be top down the. I'll just start with probability on the next side of the phone. Okay. Is everyone good?
Are you going from probability and then frontlining, or probability then on third?
Probability and then C2.
Okay.
Everyone good? All right. start on probability, recognize nothing is more probable than the status quo. That's why we were telling you that 67% of all businesses in the status quo are small businesses, innovate the best. But even more so, I would argue that prices are decreasing in the status quo. More on that later. Then go to our second tension about, like, basically monopolies. They tell you from Stanford that 90% of all innovation is bad because it just accesses Me Too drugs. But the problem is small businesses have a vested interest in not creating Me Too drugs because our evidence tells you that small businesses only generate profits off 2 or 3 drugs. That means if you have a price control of those 3 or 2 drugs become less profitable, that's what forces them to even merge into bigger companies who actually do Me Too drugs. Me Too drugs, in order to do Me Too drugs, you need to have a vast capability of distributing medicine, and these small businesses don't have that. That's why they don't do businesses. But then there's second response talks about small businesses and monopolies. But recognize right now we're telling you from India, historically, empirically, this is on our side. When India implemented price controls, they saw a decrease in 15% of small businesses because of the regulatory costs. But even more so, I would argue the other frontline applies even more so because we're telling you from our Shane evidence that it is counterproductive. Then they go on to like our solvency arguments about skepticism. He tries to group skepticism and investment. They tell you from Berkman's that only 2% is venture capital, and he says that VC is bad because it's short term. No, VC is good because it incentivizes people to innovate in a short time. That's why we're seeing that 67% of all small firms who receive money is super, super good. But then he talks about the NIH and the public sector. Recognize the public sector and the NIH still needs money from private investors. Investors as a whole are a good thing, and they just tell you that VC is bad. But I would argue investment as a whole is a prereq because investment needs to come first. Now let's go on to their case. Recognize that they talk about like the market but their uniqueness evidence is super bad. Prices are going down for 6 reasons. First is self-awareness. Kelly Barnes explains that recent price hikes amid front-page news, which has companies worrying about bad press and legislative actions, which is why she concludes that pharma companies are decreasing prices to avoid this. Second is discounts. Gillen 18 reports that 40% of all drugs are subject to discounts. Third is negotiations. Bloomington in 2017 explains that large insurance companies were able to decrease their price of drugs by 21% through negotiation. Fourth is generics. And the AAM explains that 90% of all prescriptions were filled in 2017 were for generic brands, which do not cost that much in the first place. They tell you that generics are like super, super expensive, but I would argue they need to tell you how expensive they are and how many people can't afford them. But the fifth response is that public programs. Shepard in 2017 explains that programs such as Medicare, Medicaid, and 340B and other programs deflate the price of drugs, and the people who need or people who are poor access through these drugs through those programs. But the sixth response is recent legislation. Vasquez writes in October that when Trump passed the gag clause legislation on October 10th, it decreased the bill that the Americans had to fill. Andre furthers that this legislation saved the average American consumer $147 million. This is why the Kaiser Foundation concludes that out-of-pocket expenditures have decreased by drugs by 14% in the last 5 years. But then let's go on to their first point. They talk about directly settling. Recognize our Morton and Bowler evidence indicates, like solves back for this because it tells you that most small firms only make their money off 1 or 2 drugs. This means that if you have price controls, those 1 or 2 drugs cannot become as profitable. That's what forces these larger companies to buy up these smaller companies, which means that if you allow these smaller companies to create good hit or miss drugs, that's what keeps them in business because then they can't be bought out, and that's what creates the incentive for them to not be bought out. But then you can also look at the Dean evidence from InCase. They find that after price controls were implemented in India, the market share of small firms decreased by 50%. That's just what's empirically true. But then on the second one about consolidation, the first act has all the risk of hurting small business. Our uniqueness evidence makes it very clear that 50% of pharma companies are small business, and 63% of new drugs come from these terms. The second response is that in their world, big firms have a huge incentive to increase mergers, as decreased revenue means companies will not be able to take as much risk and will have to resort to stealing drugs from seller markets through M&A. But the third response is that make them give an example of a country who implemented price controls and saw a market control of monopolies decline. If they can't do that, I would argue you have to defer to India. But fourth, recognize that high costs of development are the root cause of market consolidation. Companies cannot afford to do it by themselves. The AF has a 100% risk of making this worse by decreasing the very revenue that is used to offset the costs in the first place. The status quo is solving and the status quo is good. But then let's go on to their first impact. They talk about wax and recognize if I break my thumb and I don't take painkillers, I'm not going to die. Make them prove to you how many people die as a direct result of prescriptions. Their second one talks about the rest of the world, but recognize IPOs can only be bought once. That means that their impacts don't actually matter because if they're bought once, they've already happened and super non-unique. Then you can turn their arguments because I would argue that there's more shortages. Price controls amplify drug shortages, as the Hill explains that pharmaceutical firms have to underwrite a negotiating process in a controlled market every time once you sell and you get medication. That's why drugs in America reach the market 90 days quicker, and they quantify 90 days quicker than in Europe, which kills 300,000 people in Europe. I would argue that drugs happen quicker in the affirmative, in the negative world, which is why you negate.
Actually, can I see a piece of pretty cross? Yeah. The non-unique read on
IPOs deal with the IPOs, right?
yeah.
Okay. You ready?
Yeah.
You're good.
Yeah, I'm good now.
Okay. So you say that small businesses don't produce Me Too drugs, so why would they be disproportionately hurt by price control?
No, yeah. So the analysis is that if small businesses only have a chance of making revenue because they produce like 2 or 3 drugs that are hit or miss, when you implement price controls, that creates a huge,
So, well, that's what I'm getting at. Like, if 90% of all drugs that are being produced out of the industry as a whole, inclusive of small businesses, are just Me Too drugs, right? So if small businesses don't produce Me Too drugs, then why would they be hurt by price control?
Repeat the question.
So if small businesses don't produce Me Too drugs, then why would they be hurt by a price control?
Because if you sell a drug, you need to make money, and we're telling you that the good drugs also can't make money if you have a price
And if
control.
they create a cure for, like, all drug prices, like Advil's not going to be like the same price as like a cancer cure, right?
But what? Yeah, that's the.
Okay, so our argument
That's
is the more
generics.
efficient drugs, the ones that have clinical significance, still create profit margins.
The argument is about speculation. These investors, right, when they
Okay.
see a market, so
2% of the funding for them, but yeah.
all venture capitalists is 2%, but all
Yeah.
investors is like all
So who are the
huge
other- who are
one,
the
right?
other investors?
So
Like
investors
the
as a
government?
whole, when they see a market in healthcare which has price controls, or they see a market like, I don't know, in Silicon Valley without price controls, comparatively
Who are
speaking,
the other
they go to the
investors?
market without price
Wait,
controls
yeah.
because that's where the most investment
Where's
is.
the market without price controls?
Silicon Valley, green technology, Isaac could keep going. He's
Okay,
got a lot
so
of
they're just going to
examples.
not invest in pharmaceuticals. So a pharmaceutical venture capitalist is not going to invest there, and they're going to invest in some other form of
Venture capitalists are venture capitalists.
Yes.
They want money. They invest in the most profitable market,
Yes.
which I would argue is not a market with price controls.
So
It's
it's
like
venture,
just
so it is
logically
venture
true.
capitalists then, right?
What?
So it is venture capitalists.
Investors, semantics is not the issue, right? Investors care about money and they want to make money.
My argument
so
is
they
that
would go
private
to places
investors are only
without price
2%
controls.
of the entire investment that the entire funds that the industry has.
Does your card talk about venture capitalists or investors as a whole?
Like, what's the difference? That was my original question.
All right, we'll just
Like,
call for it and then we can move on.
Okay.
All right, yeah.
Do you have a question?
Yeah. So let's talk about. So what I said in my rebuttal was that I asked you to give me an example of a country where you had price controls and then the market share of monopolies decreased.
Okay, so you want me to give you an example?
Yeah.
Norway?
Do you have evidence?
Yeah.
All right, we'll call for that too. Okay.
So, the Dean evidence. Let's talk about your empiric in India.
Wait, real quick.
Wait, no, my turn.
I just thought of something.
So,
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Dean evidence, does it talk about small businesses or generic drugs?
What do you mean?
So,
I mean,
we found the Dean evidence, and it
Okay.
says generics, like generic manufacturers, which are the same thing as Me Too drugs.
Wait, no,
Right.
you're talking about
So-
India, right?
Yes, India. Like, we have the Dean evidence. It's
Okay,
talking
okay.
about generics.
No. It talks about generic small firms, but those small firms in India aren't the same type of small firms as the small firms in America. That's why
Was there a
67%.
monopoly in India?
What?
Was there a monopoly in the market in
The
India?
the market share of small businesses decreased.
Was there a monopoly there?
That's what a monopoly means. Like if small businesses decrease, that means
No.
the merger.
That's not the same thing.
Later in the article, he concludes that the smaller businesses got bought out by the larger businesses, and they in essence merged.
So that's what your argument is. They're going to be increased mergers and acquisitions.
Sure.
Okay.
Okay. So could I see Norway? And then wait, no. You're speaking first.
Yeah, we'll wait.
I'll for it later. Yeah. They just yeah. But sort of like they just cross the line. But like just small
I'm going to start on the top of my case and go to my first link after that. Everybody good?
One more time, what was that?
The top of my case, and then I'm going to go to my first link.
Okay.
Everyone's ready? Alright. start on the top of my case, they read 6 responses, group the first 4 together. These are all intentional reasons why prices go down temporarily. I would say you prefer the Waxman analysis that says over the past 20 years, they have increased steadily by 10%. The reason why this is true is because this is literally monopoly tactics to lower the prices temporarily, to undercut small businesses, to hike the prices in the future, to drive out these businesses. That's literally feeding into our narrative on our second warrant. But secondly, they say that Medicare access is going to increase, and then they there's gag clause. Even if there's Medicare access and gag clause, the Waxman card at the bottom of our case says that 1/3 of Americans still can't afford their drugs. Passing more price controls is still good for us. This is why you vote for us on setting the price directly. This is the cleanest way for you to vote, and is untouched by them in the round. Costa explains that 40% increase, or setting the price controls will decrease drug costs by 40%, which means it's 100% probable these 125,000 people who can't afford drugs now will be able to afford their drugs when you vote for the app. That's the cleanest way to vote if you don't want to evaluate the rest of this mess on the flow. But then on consolidations, they say that 57% of the existing companies are small businesses. That doesn't matter. Sorcher explains that 64% of the market is controlled by one big monopoly. Even if the small businesses exist, they're destined to fail in the future because the market is being controlled by the monopoly, up from 28% in 2007. Historically, this is true, but if you want to continue in their trend, that's only going to increase the monopolies in the future. We tell you the Gagnon card is very, very clear when they say the monopolies exist to kill off these small businesses by buying up their package and killing off competition. That's why the Brecky analysis tells you how we solve the problem in 2 different ways. A, on intent. The reason why these monopolies buy up these other small businesses is to hike up the prices. If they can't hike up the prices, there's no reason to buy up these small businesses. But secondly, on capacity, even if the intent goes up, capacity goes down because they cannot afford to buy up these mergers and acquisitions. This gives us a link into their case on monopolies. They basically say that small businesses create good innovation. We tell you, Life of Sanford explains that 90% of innovation that they advocate for right now is clinically insignificant, as the status quo is bad. It's the reason why the monopolies that exist in the status quo is basically complacent. That also makes sense because monopolies don't want to invest in good innovation because it's far riskier. And if they want to destroy these monopolies, you'd have to vote for us first. But then on the bottom of their case, you can vote for us off NIH. They basically don't touch this in their summary or in their rebuttal. We say that 73% come from the public sector as terminal defense on their case. Vote out.
Hold on, wait, actually, Norway, and then the other thing I want to.
Okay. What was the other thing? You didn't.
Just give me Norway first.
Okay.
This studies data these states.
What happened up here?
My stream counted. I live in Florida.
That was 11 seconds. It's going to start off on our C2, and I'll signpost from there. Are we all good?
Andrew got to our side with 30 seconds left. It's not enough to cover the flow. Extend our milk and evidence. It indicates that small business represents 70% of the industry's future clinical pipeline. This subsumes all their Me Too drugs evidence because what it ultimately means is that all drugs go down, not just Me Too drugs, which ultimately means that they don't win any of their internals into this Me Too drug nonsense. Extend our Investopedia evidence. It indicates that regulation favors pharma companies large enough to have reliable income sources. This turns their own arguments about big pharma. Big pharma is uniquely suited to handle price controls where small firms are not, which ultimately means that we control the best internal link into innovation. Also extend our cliff evidence, which indicates that lowering drug out profits makes pharma less desirable for investors. This means that the entire industry, starts to lose growth as soon as you affirm and implement proper price controls. The most damning concession is our Grabowski evidence, which indicates that startups in particular require large investment for risky early stage R&D. That answers back all their warnings about Me Too drugs. Since price controls destroys the precondition for innovative drugs to exist in the first place, the R&D is risky, and that's what they disincentivize. They disincentivize risky investment and encourage safe investment, which is ultimately why they end up causing more Me Too drugs than we do. Also extend our Lichtenberg evidence that indicates that each new innovative drug saves 17,000 lives. It outweighs the prereq to all their access arguments. In order to have affordable products, they need to exist first, and that only happens through innovation. Moving on to their side, first extend our Andrew says NIH really quick, but NIH invests in startups. We solved that too. Moving on to their side, extend the drop shortages turn. It's the easiest way to vote in this round. Our evidence indicates that shortages caused 600,000 people to die in Europe. It's so easy to vote for this because literally it's conceded. It indicates that 600,000 people die if you have price controls because shortages happen. Literally, this round's essentially over. They are shuffling deck chairs on the Titanic. Extend our argument about how if you buy up the IPs that are already bought, you can't do anything about it if you affirm. That ultimately means that their impact is happening now. There's nothing you can do about it. The only thing you can do is vote for us, and there's a chance that we might be able to do something that's somewhat good.
You guys good for cross?
Y'all can have the first question.
Awesome. So let's talk about the shortages evidence, right? It's the Spiegel evidence, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so who does Spiegel work for? Yeah, who does Spiegel work for?
You want to tell me?
Yeah, so like he's the former CEO of the large national NGO.
Like, is this why you didn't respond to it? So that
Because it's
like-
pretty bad.
Also, wait a minute. You couldn't respond to
Very
it because
bad.
there wasn't a warrant. You just asserted
Yeah,
that shortages
very
are going to
bad.
happen out of nowhere
Wait,
and
no,
then
no, no.
extend the
So-
blip
so
that was the
I might
last
have read
10
it a little
seconds of your
fast, but the
rebuttal.
warrant was because
So
they
it's not the
take-
EU, right? Like the delay in the EU.
No,
Yeah,
so the warrant
that's
was
what you said in the
because
book.
drugs need to get approved
Right.
because of
So-
federal red tape, and that's what causes.
And you were like, in the EU, it's delayed, right?
I said in all of Europe. I don't know.
Okay, sure. So why does drugs take longer to approve in the EU?
Wait, why does this matter? You dropped it.
It definitely does matter because it means your card's
the
pretty bad.
argument
Like,
is that
we're
You can call for
price
it.
controls
This is why we're-
institute negotiations between pharma
I have-
companies and the government, which ultimately means it takes too long for the drugs to end up reaching the population. That's what causes our
Okay,
It's
so
new drugs, right?
The reason why it takes a long time for approval to happen in EU is because they have to go to every single country to get approved, then be
Wait,
able
no,
to
our
distribute
evidence
it.
doesn't say EU anywhere. It just says
So
Europe.
you
talk
gave
about
the
delays.
example of the EU in your rebuttal.
Okay.
Wait, is it talking about the delay of new drugs from entering the market?
I can show you the card.
Wait, no, I'm just asking. Is it shortages about delaying the entry of new drugs into the market, right?
Yeah.
So it's innovation because you have to create the drug first, then, right?
No. Even if they wanted to get existing drugs from other countries, the delay would still exist because they have to set the price. Any
What?
new drug,
No,
even if it's not newly made, any new drug that enters the market has to have a federal price, right? And the negotiation that occurs between pharma and these different governments is what causes these shortages.
How is this offense for you? Like, is it just they're not going to
price
sell any
controls
drugs in the
result in
United
delays.
States?
Kills
Why does it result in
people.
delays?
Because negotiations
Yeah.
between pharma and government equal
Are gonna
long
take
We're
a while.
retreading the same ground here. Our
Yeah.
argument is that when you institute price controls, you mandate negotiations between big pharma.
Don't you run this
and
on the other
government.
side?
No,
we don't.
no, we don't. This
That's
is
some other team.
This is really confusing, and we think it doesn't have a warrant. It's just that they
No.
take a while to negotiate
second
what
stop
the
by
price
you,
is.
like-
The
It's fine.
prices
It's fine. We can
or
just
the
outweigh
pharmaceutical?
it. But like, can I ask you a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so you extend on your case that like investment goes down, right? Okay, yeah, that's fine. So if we tell you that the public sector can subsidize for these investments, are small
Okay,
businesses
this-
still lost?
This response was like 10 seconds after the timer went off.
So it's like it doesn't count.
I don't think it does, but like. I don't know.
You mean the public sector?
Yeah, the
that
public
was
sector.
in time and from rebuttal.
Also,
Okay.
Isaac also said that the NIH funds startups. Like that's pretty
The
good.
way
Yeah,
the
so
NIH
small
works
businesses,
is that
startups, right?
it funds small businesses, but the problem is that the small businesses need to like exist in the first place. And our argument is that they don't get off the ground whatsoever without these.
And even if they do, they get bought out.
Okay.
We're going to take the last 20 seconds. Everyone's ready? It's going to be the same order as Andrew's summary. Or case sections. Okay. They dropped everything about how prices are going right down in summary, which means we have uniqueness. Remember the Waxman evidence. Over the past 20 years, drug prices have increased 10 times the rate of inflation. 1/3 of Americans cannot afford their prescriptions, and 125,000 people die every year because of this, which makes the easiest place for you to vote of our first link on directly setting the price. The cost evidence is very clear. Remember, the moment you implement price controls, you reduce prices by 40%. This outweighs on probability because you don't want to speculate and see if small businesses are actually going to go out of business. You don't want to speculate and see if there's an unwarranted shortage that's going to occur in the first place. And this, they're going to say it's a prerequisite, but this also outweighs on urgency. So we know for a fact that we're going to be saving these people's lives. We don't have time for this prerequisite to happen in the first place. You need to save these lives now and affirm. But the second place we win the debate is off of the consolidation argument. This is where most of the clash is occurring. But the uniqueness is going to control the direction of the link. Essentially, they say that 50% of all industries are small businesses. But our evidence is better than this. 64% of the market is controlled by one company, which means that there is a big monopolization in the industry right now. This throws all of their warrants out the door on small businesses losing capital, because that only happens if there isn't a monopoly on the market. Insofar as monopolies exist right now, we are the only ones that solve that. The break evidence is specific in two key ways. First, we reduce the incentive for monopolization because they monopolize to high prices. It's no longer affordable for them to do that. But secondly, we reduce their capacity to do so, means they have to take funds away from mergers and acquisitions and try and subsidize innovation in their own sense, which is why you can cleanly send the break analysis. You reduce the amount of brand name market share by 15%. You break apart monopolies. This also links in to their second contention on small businesses, because small businesses are benefited. This is a prerequisite to any of their link. You need to get rid of the monopoly before small businesses exist. But secondly, we have the independent turn on Me Too drugs. They just say that there's going to be more Me Too drugs. That doesn't make any sense. 90% of the entire industry is Me Too drugs right now. But even if you give them all small businesses, this is an independent reason to vote for us, because this means we have big pharma and small businesses all creating clinically significant new drugs, because the only drugs that make money are ones that cure cancer. We are a better link into their impact.
So it's just going to start on our second contention. I'll sign those from there. Is everyone good? All right. They make a huge mistake by not responding to risk. Go to the uniqueness debate. Our Milken Institute evidence indicates that small businesses represent 70% of the industries in the future clinical pipeline. This doesn't account for Me Too drugs, it accounts for all drugs. At this point, we control the overarching uniqueness. And then we tell you that all drug prices would go down if you keep the status quo. Then our Investopedia evidence tells you that uniquely, that Big Pharma is more uniquely suited to handle price controls because they have more federal power and they are better regulation. This creates a comparative advantage between Big Pharma and Small Pharma, which means Small Market Pharma cannot compete, which causes the mergers that they too are so bad. But then the CHHP evidence tells you that this is less survivable for growth because they merge. But then the Garbowski evidence is completely conceded. Isaac does a good job of weighing it. It indicates that startups in particular require large investment for risky early stage development. If we tell you that affirming or implementing price controls creates even a chance of risk, that means all investment would not go in because innovation is hit or miss, which means that large firms would just keep innovating Me Too drugs because they're less risky. This risk argument answers back all of their arguments, because if risk increases, you don't create good drugs, you create profitable drugs, which are Me Too drugs, regardless of if you are a big or small firm. This answers back all their arguments. Then the Lichtenberg evidence goes conceded. It tells you that each new innovative drug saves 20,000 people every year. This means that we answer back all of their arguments because, I don't know, do the math. If you make 10 drugs, that saves 200,000 people, bigger than their number. But then even more so, I would argue that startups solve back, and they talk about like the 90% Me Too drugs, that's answered back by risk. Now let's go on to their case. They drop shortages because they noted they respond to it in summary. This indicates that because of the federal red tape and because of the regulations happening between Europe and the United States, what this means is that there would be a long waiting time. That kills 600,000 people. The round is literally over when Isaac made that joke about the Titanic, because it indicates that they can't do anything because startups are a prerequisite. If you don't have drugs, it doesn't matter how cheap they are because they're not even reaching the consumer. Big pharma would always engage in things because they don't have they have a comparative advantage over small pharma. Then they talk about the two solvency mechanisms. First on incentive, and second they talk about subsidizing these things. But recognize, overarchingly, we tell you that the risk controls this argument. But even more so, they tell you unions controls the direction of the lane. That's why small pharma is doing so well right now. They tell you that monopolies are like controlling a large more portion of the market, but that doesn't matter insofar as small businesses are still innovating and would be responsible for 75% of the future market. That's why you negate it.